All right, tonight let's take a look at the end of the war, well, 1863 to the end of the war. Last lecture, we talked about the Emancipation Proclamation being the event that turns the tide, really, of the war. It's one of the most pivotal moments in the war, and it's also one of the most misunderstood moments in the war. In 1862, Lincoln had already started to push through the idea of emancipating the slaves. And he began to sort of push that through his cabinet. It wasn't necessarily a very popular thing then, but by the late 1862, especially after the at least perceived victory at Antietam, although if you kind of looked at that video very carefully and read a little bit about Antietam, you would know that that's not necessarily what happened. But anyway, Lincoln felt like it was now time to emancipate the slaves, and he was ready to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, we all know that this is a huge event because the most misunderstood part of it is that most students think that it frees the slaves. And that's not quite what happens. Okay. The Emancipation Proclamation only freed the slaves in areas that were in open rebellion. So essentially, the Emancipation Proclamation only applied to these states that are technically the Confederate states. So we're talking Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas. Okay. According to the Emancipation Proclamation, slaves in those areas were officially free. Okay. This law or this proclamation did not apply to the border states. Okay. So technically, in Missouri, in Kentucky, in Delaware, and in Maryland, the slaves were not freed because those states were not in open rebellion against the nation. So technically, this Emancipation Proclamation only applied to the states that were in open rebellion. Now, let's explain this for a second. Let's think about this for a second. Essentially, what the Confederate States have done is seceded from the Union, and they don't feel that they're part of the United States anymore. And so, essentially, you have to treat them like a foreign country, or at least they believe that they're a foreign country. What law or what right would a foreign country have to tell us what to do? And the answer is they wouldn't. And so Lincoln here is essentially freeing the slaves in a foreign country, which of course the governors, the leaders of the Confederacy just laugh at because the uh, the national law as it exists now doesn't exist anymore. These states have left the Union. But it is an important moment because number one, it changes the focus of the war. Before, the war had been a war to preserve the Union, which is not a very motivational thing, but a war to free the slaves, a war to destroy the inhumanity of slavery. That is something that's worth thinking about. And so the what the what Lincoln essentially does here is shift the focus of the war to freeing the slaves. And it does a couple of things. Okay. One, it puts a lot of pressure on the Confederacy because they immediately begin to worry that word about the Emancipation Proclamation will get out, that slave revolt could potentially happen. And so that is a tremendous worry. The other thing that could potentially happen, of course, is that African Americans could rally to the cause and could join the Union forces, and they do. So there would be several, all right, major groups of African Americans that would join and become a part of the Union Army. And of course, they are segregated. They are led by white officers, but you do see them beginning to experience really some of the idea of freedom, or at least fighting for the freedom of themselves or others like them. The most famous of the recruited African American regiments was the 54th Massachusetts. Okay, it was recruited and led and played a large part in some of the battles during the war. If you've ever seen Glory, and if you haven't seen Glory, I would recommend that you do. That it is an example of how furiously many of these African American regiments and many of these African American soldiers fought for not only their own freedom, but the freedom of others as well. So if you've never seen Glory, go and take a look at it. All these dots that you see on this map are where African Americans participated in Civil War battles. And if you even notice here in Mississippi, the part of the Grant's campaign, all right, to lay siege to Vicksburg here, it sees African American participation. So, including the Battle of Jackson here. Okay, so, and we'll talk about some of these, but you can see that all across really the American South, African Americans participated in these Civil War battles. So, and usually wherever they could, they would also free the slaves of surrounding people in the countryside. Now, let's remember that the southern states have left the Union, and so they don't really participate in the national government anymore. And so while they are out of the government, you see that the uh, the legislative process, Congress still continues to go on. Okay, the Homestead Act is passed in 1862. Right, the Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect on the 1st of 1863. The Pacific Railway Act, which is going to lay the funding for many of these railways that end up being part of the Transcontinental Railroad. Okay, so the business of the country continues. But 1863 is also one of the most pivotal years for the fighting itself. Okay, and let's take a look at two of the major theaters. Okay, one is the West, and that takes us to Vicksburg. And I told you guys before that if that one of my favorite historians about this, who just recently passed away, Ed Barrs, wrote extensively about the Western Theater. Nobody paid really all that much attention to the Western Theater until Ed Barrs came along. But Vicksburg here became a huge sore for the Union Army. Without controlling Vicksburg, they did not control the Mississippi River. And controlling the Mississippi River was part of the Anaconda Plan. It would have split the Confederacy into two parts, and it was extremely frustrating that Vicksburg had not been taken control of, and that the river still remained, at least in this part, in Confederate hands. Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, is sent into this area to deal with the situation. And Grant tries several ways to try to find a way across the river, and eventually even into to try to launch his attack. Okay, and he will finally succeed by crossing the river in Grand Gulf, right, and Bruinsburg, and pushing through Port Gibson in May of 1863, and then pushing his way to Raymond in May of 1863. The Battle of Raymond takes place, excuse me, on the 12th of May, 1863. If you've never been to the Raymond battlefield right outside of town, you should go. It's the Friends of Raymond have done a very good job of trying to preserve and educate people about the fighting that takes place there. The Union forces are pushing their way to Jackson because they want to destroy the railroad. Once they make it to Jackson, then they will turn back and push back towards Vicksburg. Probably the heaviest fighting takes place here at Champions Hill. Okay, the Battle of Champion Hill is a major battle, and it is probably the besides the siege of Vicksburg is the biggest battle in the campaign. After defeating the Confederate forces at Champion Hill, who then retreat back into Vicksburg, you guys can see that Grant laid siege to Vicksburg from May until, well, the middle of May until June, or excuse me, until the 4th of July, 1863. And so Vicksburg is going to fall to the Union Army just about the time that the Battle of Gettysburg is taking place. So this war in the West is going to be one of the choices that you can do for your last little discussion board assignment. I'll have a little video here about the Vicksburg campaign, but the other, of course, is Gettysburg. And for some reason, well, we know the reason that Lee decides to kind of take an all-out approach to push the war into Union territory and to break out of Virginia and to really take the battle to some of these other states. And I think the hope is that by showing some of these states that war could come to their doorstep, that they would start to think about at least maybe negotiating an end to the war. And so after Chancellorsville, okay, after the battles at Fredericksburg and then Chancellorsville in May of 1863, Lee's army, with the Army in Northern Virginia, will push north into Maryland and then into Pennsylvania. And they are going to find themselves here at the town of Gettysburg. The fighting at Gettysburg is some of the most intense, and this, of course, will be your other chance to watch the video and to see what the fighting at Gettysburg is like. I mean, if you look here, you can see that the terrain kind of tells you everything. Okay, the Union positions, all right, are the green lines basically take up the high point. Notice they're all entrenched on places like Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, all right, Seminary Ridge, okay. So McPherson's Ridge here. So essentially, the Union tries to keep the high ground. The rolling in Confederates are going to try to push them out of that high ground. And if you've ever played, King of the Hill, you understand how difficult that can be. And so it leads to Lee kind of almost in an all or nothing scenario. And you see some incredible bravery, some tremendous fighting in Gettysburg, the most famous being Pickett's Charge here. So when you see that in the film, you'll understand just how brutal some of this fighting was in and around these areas. The costs, okay. So Meade's force was probably sometime or around 75,000. Okay, he lost 3,000 killed, 14,000 wounded at Gettysburg. Lee's force a little bit smaller, but he also took more casualties, almost 4,000 killed and over 18,000 wounded. So Gettysburg is one of the, of course, most famous battles in the war, and of course, it will also be the scene of Lincoln, one of Lincoln's greatest moments as president when he returns to Gettysburg to deliver the Gettysburg Address. When Lincoln came there to really to sanctify the ground for it to become a battlefield, a cemetery, a resting place for those who had fought there. The kind of the most interesting thing is that the person that spoke before Lincoln spoke for over 2 hours. All right. And Lincoln spoke for probably 2 minutes. The Gettysburg Address, of course, is always considered to be one of the most important things that Lincoln did. And if you're not familiar with the Gettysburg Address, or if you never had to memorize it in your high school history classes, one, shame on you. And two, All right, go and look it up. And the Gettysburg Address is where we get some of these famous lines, and Lincoln does an amazing job. The uh, the North in 1863, to try to push the war into the South, will initiate the draft. Before this, a lot of people volunteered. Most of the forces were volunteers, right? And it was almost very casual as well. You could pay somebody to take your place if you were, if you didn't want to go, you could pay someone to fill in your place. Okay, the no matter what, the draft is never a very popular thing. And so immigrants would be drafted in New York City. Of course, African Americans would be. And then, of course, it leads to violence in certain places as well, especially in July of 1863. So a lot of people don't realize that. You've had two great successes in 1863. Vicksburg has fallen. Gettysburg, excuse me, Gettysburg has happened, and uh, Lee's forces, after the defeat at Gettysburg, have been pushed back into the South. And so you've had two really great moments. And, a few weeks later, you have draft riots breaking out in New York City because of the draft that had been imposed. So you can see that the war, even though it's become a war to free the slaves, it's become a war that's becoming more successful for the North, is not necessarily going all that well. And it leads to really some bad feelings. Okay. There are lots of instances of racial violence in the North and in the South against African Americans, against the slaves or even the former slaves. So it's a very tense time. The uh, the progress of the war, and we can look at this and kind of figure it out, that by about 1864, you get into really this period of about 1864 or so, that, and we're kind of looking for these green and purple areas, that the the North has been successful pushing their way, really focusing a lot of the fighting here in Richmond, and because remember, this is the Confederate capital here. But also remember, we've seen them take Vicksburg and deny the Mississippi River to the Confederacy. And so now you can sort of see where the next move is as they begin to push this way. And one of the things that the North is going to want to do is to keep splitting up the South. So the river here, controlling the river, has split them up here. The So Louisiana, Texas, Arkansas are essentially split off from the rest of the Confederacy. But now, if you can drive really out of Tennessee and head towards the sea here, then you will split off this part from this part. And of course, you still want to take Richmond. And this is really most of the fighting in 1864. The most famous being Sherman's March to the Sea. And I remember me telling you that they could drive out of Chattanooga and then cut off another part of the Confederacy. They wanted to do so. And so William Tecumseh Sherman will push out of Tennessee, push his way through Atlanta, and then all the way down to Savannah. Then when he turns from Savannah, he will turn north to Columbia, South Carolina, and then into North Carolina, pushing really the Confederate Army back as he goes. Sherman's March to the Sea is also famous because it's one of the first real instances, and a lot of people have debated this and have talked about this. And even my friend Mr. Wedding, who teaches philosophy, who went to Southern with me, he was a philosophy major as well. That's why he teaches philosophy at Hines now. But he was also a history major. And he wrote his history master's thesis on Sherman's March to the Sea, and he talks about how this is an example really of total warfare, where you take the fight not just to the enemy army, but to its civilians and to its cities. And so the most famous thing about Sherman's March to the Sea is that all along this way, he burned the cities. He burned areas as he went through them. He burned Atlanta almost to the ground. So Sherman's March to the Sea is a great example of how far really the war has progressed. In 1864, Lincoln faced re-election, and his biggest challenge was from his former general, George McClellan. McClellan will actually become a candidate for the Democratic Party, and it will continue a split party, really, because the South, remember, is out of the Union, so they can't vote. And so there really was never much of a doubt about Lincoln's ability to win. You can see dominates the electoral vote and got 55% of the popular vote. So Lincoln is reelected in 1864, of course, sees that as a mandate for his policies to continue, and he will continue to sort of push the war. And most of the fighting in 1864 and 1865 takes place in Virginia. And these are some of the worst campaigns. Uh, Grant is now in charge. After his success at Vicksburg, Grant has been hired to defeat Lee. And so Grant will push out of really Maryland and other places and begin to drive Lee back, heading for Richmond. What you guys can see is the Confederate capital right here. So you can see kind of the during the Wilderness Campaign, and then during these battles that sort of take place through here, you can essentially see the ending of the Confederacy. The Wilderness Campaign in May of 1864 takes place there, Spotsylvania Courthouse, right here, North Anna, and then Cold Harbor. Cold Harbor is one of the most brutal battles in the war. Essentially, it saw Grant attacking a prepared and entrenched position held by the Confederates. The expected battle was so bad that really that the soldiers started taking out pieces of paper and writing their names and their hometowns and their addresses on their backs, and having their friends pin that information on their backs so that the burial details later could find them and could get their bodies back home. After Cold Harbor, and Grant, by the way, always thought that Cold Harbor was his biggest mistake. He really kind of botched Cold Harbor. It was really brutal. But he will push south. Petersburg, lay siege to Petersburg in June of 1864. Okay, but also break out and continue to push Lee, all right, until Lee surrenders in April of 1865 at Appomattox Courthouse. So this is the end, okay? And Lincoln really already had a plan for what he wanted to see happen after the final surrender. So in April of 1865, the war officially comes to a close when Robert E. Lee and Grant signed the surrender papers at Appomattox. All right. By the way, the Civil War sees the most casualties that any war we've really ever faced. Okay, there are huge amounts of death rates. Okay, so for example, you have these huge amounts, almost 200,000 that die from wounds. Okay, you have another 350,000 that die, of 375,000 that die from disease. So if you sort of look at the Confederate Army and the Northern armies, I mean, they lost 23%, 24%, right, of those people that fought died. Okay. So when you compare that to other wars, you can see why the Civil War, when we view the Civil War as something really different. Look at World War II. Okay. In World War II, we fought for 4 years on two different fronts with modern weapons, with airplanes, with radio, with trains, with ships and submarines. And we had 318,000 soldiers killed during World War II. In Vietnam, in 10 years of fighting in Vietnam, we lost a little over 56,000 men in 10 years of fighting in Vietnam with automatic weapons and napalm and everything else. But the Civil War, 620,000 Americans die in 4 years due to the Civil War. And you say, why? Well, because we talked about this a little bit earlier, they were fighting with uh, out sort of moded tactics with very up to date weapons, and the killing was intense. So the really the war becomes a war almost of attrition. The the next really sort of thing is that Lincoln had Lincoln had developed a plan for what he wanted to have happen after the war. And he had already announced it. He had already sort of made it very clear that he wanted the South to come back into the Union as quickly and painlessly as possible. The he sort of, I guess, in a way, after fighting for 4 years, had sort of viewed the South sort of like the prodigal son in the uh, the Bible stories. That you have the prodigal son go away, but then comes back and is welcomed with open arms. Now that's not the most popular view, not even in Lincoln's own party. There were many that believed that the South needed to be punished for leaving the Union. There were a lot inside of Lincoln's party that believed the South had, when those states had left the Union, they had essentially become conquered territories. And now they had to go through the whole process of statehood again. And of course, that would be controlled by Congress, not the president. But Lincoln took a very different tack, and Lincoln had already announced that he believed that this was the best option for the South to come back in as quickly and as painlessly as possible. Lincoln had proposed something already called the 10% plan. Essentially, what he said was if you could get 10% of Southerners to take an oath that they didn't support the Confederacy, that 10% could then form a new government and could adopt a state constitution. Of course, that would do away with slavery, and they could get back into the Union quickly. Okay. Now, for the South and for many Southern states, where most of the fighting has taken place, where most of the damage has taken place, where they are now essentially a conquered territory, Lincoln's plan may be the best option for them because once they're back in the Union, they could then get federal funds, get federal assistance, and help them rebuild. That's why we're going to call this period Reconstruction. But inside Lincoln's plan, or inside Lincoln's party, excuse me, this plan was not the most widely accepted plan. And even some of his own major supporters did not like the fact that Lincoln was going around and saying, "Hey, look, let's get these guys back into the Union, but let's not make them. We don't have to say anything about them doing away with slavery. Let's just get them back in, and then we will fix the rest." And like I said, that might have been the South's best hope for a transition back into the Union as painlessly as possible. But then the unthinkable happens. In April of 1865, not too long after the war ends, Lincoln and his wife are going to going to the theater to see a production of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington. And so at this production, Lincoln will be assassinated. He will be shot, and he will die at Ford's Theater, well, right across the street. The assassin is John Wilkes Booth, who is a Southern sympathizer who believes, of course, that Lincoln is evil, that Lincoln had brought about the war. And so after he shot Lincoln, he jumped down the stage, which broke his leg. He jumped down out of the balcony and broke his leg. But when he hit the stage, he shouted "Sic Semper Tyrannis," this to all tyrants, and then sort of hobbled away. And Lincoln will die a few hours later. Massive manhunt takes place for John Wilkes Booth. And eventually, he and his conspirators would be rounded up. And after killing Lincoln, right, those people that or those people that were involved in the plot will be executed. Now, once Lincoln is out of the picture, okay, once Lincoln is dead, this might have been even though John Wilkes Booth thought he was doing something incredible for the South, what he actually has done is doom them to a period of very harsh Reconstruction. And I'll talk a little bit about that in the next little video.